I've heard the music of Renata Zeiguer described simply as indie rock, but in reality, it is so much more than this label suggests. On her 2018 album Old Ghost, she incorporates a variety of other genres, ranging from dream pop to bossa nova to grungy alternative rock. This mixture of styles results in a unique approach to composition, and the music theory of her song, After All, is a wonderful example of this approach. Let's take a listen. After All starts in the key of E major. This is illustrated in the opening section's vocal melody, which stays entirely within that key. The accompanying chord progression, however, is much less straightforward. C-sharp minor is a pretty normal place to start, as the relative minor chord in this key. But then, the next chord is an A minor, a borrowed chord from the parallel minor key, E minor. This is a chromatic mediant chord change, and while it is one of the more common places to hear this kind of change, it still has a characteristically unsettling sound. The next chord transforms things even further, an F-sharp major. This is yet another chord from outside our key, a 2 major instead of a 2 minor. In this case, the chord change is a particularly bright sound, in part due to the chromatic movement of the A and C up to the A-sharp and C-sharp. Finally, the F-sharp major moves forward on the circle of fifths to B major. This chord, serving as a 5 major chord, is voiced here as an augmented chord. There's a certain logic to this. As the section repeats and the B augmented moves back to the C-sharp minor, we get another upward chromatic movement, this time from the D-sharp and G up to the E and G-sharp. This makes for a stronger resolution, and also mirrors the type of movement used between the A minor and the F-sharp major. This section alone demonstrates two techniques that Renata uses throughout the album, playing around with chord qualities and using simple diatonic melodies over complex chords. How is it that such a melody fits so well over these chords? Upon closer examination, you can see it was cleverly written to emphasize the root and fifth of each chord, and as a result it does not clash with these chord quality alterations. In fact, this means the melody would work just as well over a more typical diatonic version of the chord progression. If we revert the chord qualities to what is the default for this key, we get a 6 minor, 4 major to minor 5 major progression, and the combination of these chords with the melody sounds very conventional. The resemblance of this section's chord progression to a simple diatonic progression illustrates the balance that Renata strikes between catchy and nuanced. In any case, this section repeats for a little while before moving to a sort of pre-verse section. This transition actually occurs one chord early, after the F sharp instead of the B, which prompts the next section to open with a B major 6 chord. In fact, it will gradually become clear that we have modulated from the key of E major to the key of B major. The song's key will actually end up changing around a few more times, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to notate the rest of the song in the B major key signature. Anyway, the pre-verse section begins like this. The voicing of the chords in this section imparts little sense of movement, which is one of the stylistic elements that Renata borrows from bossa nova music. I think this feature highlights a sort of ambiguity between the B major 6 and the G sharp minor 7th, two chords which have a mediant relationship and, as it happens, consist of the same notes. This ambiguity in turn helps us make sense of this jazzy D-sharp augmented 7th chord. At first, this chord may have a strong resemblance to the B augmented chord from the intro section. It may even be tempting to label it as a B augmented add 9 chord. However, this would not explain much from a functional harmony perspective. Rather, it would make more sense to focus on the tritone within this chord, which tends to hint at a dominant chord. With this in mind, we can see the framework of a 5-1 change, where the D-sharp is a 5 dominant 7th to the G-sharp minor's 1 minor. Of course, this interpretation depends on the interchangeability of G-sharp minor 7th and B major 6, as I mentioned earlier. Treating the G-sharp minor 7th as the 1 minor in this chord change helps establish that we are in the key of B major, where G-sharp minor is the relative minor. That said, you could still make the argument that we are in the key of E major. This would give us an alternate set of chord functions. Using the 7 chord as a secondary dominant is a little strange, but as it turns out, Renata uses this substitution somewhat often. Still, the chord functions are more straightforward in B major. It also helps that this section begins on a B major 6 chord, and that the vocal melody basically highlights a B major pentatonic scale. The situation becomes more complicated in the second half of this section, however. To begin with, the A-sharp 7 chord is outside our key, and then there's also this sort of random-sounding chromatic slide from C7 to B7. These last two chords are particularly dissonant, in part because the mix at this point is rather noisy and indistinct, but also because the vocal melody, which up to this point has been pretty straightforward, clashes against them. If we combine the melody notes with the chords, we get a very spicy C7 sharp 11 and B7 sharp 9. So what are the chord functions here? It's lucky that we position ourselves in the key of B major. Here, the A-sharp 7 is a 7 dominant 7th chord. Again, this is a somewhat less traditional place for a secondary dominant, but not unreasonable. If we had stayed in E major, though, there would have been no elegant way to label this chord. Generally, no one wants to look at a sharp 4 or flat 5 chord function. Nonetheless, the chord change from E major to A-sharp 7 has a pretty dramatic sound, two major chords separated by a tritone. And yet, this change is actually kind of a part of the diatonic circle of fifths progression, albeit that part of the circle of fifths where the tritone is. From the A-sharp 7, we move on to the G-sharp minor, the 6 minor chord. This subverts the usual movement of a secondary dominant, but at least it stays inside our key. Then, we have to contend with these two weird dominant 7th chords. In the key of B major, they would have the functions of flat 2 dominant 7th and 1 dominant 7th, a pretty unusual place for chords with a lot of tensions. Ultimately, from the B7, we move back to the simple bass groove rooted in E, and finally an E major chord on the guitar. Chord tensions are often used to compel a resolution, so perhaps these chords are being used to modulate back to the key of E major. In E major, these chords function instead as a flat 6 dominant 7th and a 5 dominant 7th. This is a pretty well-precedented jazz trope, where the flat 6 dominant 7th acts as a tritone substitution for the 2 dominant 7th, itself a common secondary dominant. The total effect of this chord change is also enhanced by the sense of chromatic approach to the strong 5 chord. In fact, this chromatic approach extends back into the G-sharp minor chord, whose G-sharp and B step down into the C7's G and B flat. This technique, along with other elements from this section, sets up a certain vocabulary that the subsequent verse sections draw from. As you can see, the verse section begins with a chromatic approach note. An A-sharp note leads repeatedly into a B major chord before returning to the root note of our presumptive 1 chord, E major. Here, the A-sharp is merely a bluesy expression, not necessarily influencing any harmonic functions, but it returns a moment later in the form of an A-sharp dominant 7th chord. At this point, the song follows a similar structure to the pre-verse, slinging us back into the key of B major where the A-sharp chord actually makes sense. This follows through to those two unusual dominant 7th chords, but instead of using them to pivot back into E major, they transition into two chords which recall the beginning of the pre-verse, D-sharp augmented 7th and B major 6. In other words, we remain in the key of B major. This time around, it looks like these chords really should be interpreted as a flat 2 dominant 7th and a 1 dominant 7th. The flat 2 dominant 7th can act as a tritone substitution for the 5 dominant 7th, which makes sense moving to the 1 chord. But making the 1 chord a secondary dominant is pretty weird since it doesn't resolve in any obvious way. Instead, it kind of sidesteps into the D-sharp augmented 7th as the two chords overlap in their usage of the notes B and D-sharp. E major and B major are adjacent keys on the circle of fifths, meaning they differ in only a single note. Yet most of After All is written in a way that accentuates the difference between these keys as much as possible. The modulations have a somewhat jarring sound, though smart composition ensures they don't sound totally random or atonal. I think this ends up being reflected, intriguingly, in the song's lyrics. Some of the first lines of the song seem to be about the phoniness of social media. This sentiment is epitomized in the repeated line and the song's namesake, and it's all in my head, after all, after all. This superficial similarity between social media and real experience is much like the similarity between E major and B major. Perhaps this song's abrupt modulations are meant to highlight this cognitive dissonance. In each pairing, one thing resembles the other, but beware of getting sucked into the mindset of treating them exactly the same way. If you do, it will be hard to make sense of anything. Lyrics aside, Renata can be just as scathing musically. Many of the tracks from this album digress into crunchy, noisy sections that are more aggressive than you're likely to hear from another dream pop artist. In After All, after 2 repetitions of the verse, there is a turnaround section where this style is employed. Here, distorted guitar and heavy bass sketch out a few simple chords. The bass line here is very similar to the opening of the pre-verse in that it moves from B to G sharp to G, but this last chord is not voiced as a D sharp augmented 7th. It is more minimalistic, instead suggesting a B major over G. In a way, this voicing more resembles a B augmented chord, which is fitting as this section leads back into the intro section, whose chord progression also turns around with a B augmented chord. From there, the song repeats each section again, just as before. However, on the second run-through, the turnaround section is replaced by an outro, which elongates the final chords of the verse. Once again, we are in the key of B major, where we get this 3 dominant 7 that changes to a 1 major, substituting for a 6 minor. Yet as the vocals continue to repeat, this section begins to develop a new direction. A double-track guitar arpeggiation begins to accompany the vocals, the other guitar drops out, and a new bass line joins in as well, cycling between the notes E and B. While none of these parts clash with B major per se, they are all very suggestive of an E major context. The only holdover against all of this is the vocal melody, which still maintains the A sharp and G notes, which together make the most sense in the key of B major. The song ends on this final, mysterious juxtaposition. After All exemplifies many of the stylistic elements of Renata Zeiguer's songwriting. All told, it contains clever modulations, bossa nova-influenced chord voicings and chord alterations, the 7 chord as a secondary dominant, simple diatonic melodies over unusual chords, and finally, some unexpectedly chaotic guitar distortion. These features can be found all throughout the album Old Ghost, on which the song appears. It is my favorite album of hers, and one that is well worth a listen if you haven't yet tried it out. This concludes my music theory analysis of After All. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.